Have you ever been publicly humiliated by someone who was supposed to love you unconditionally? Have you ever sat in a room full of people, your own family, and felt like the smallest person there? Not because of anything you did wrong, but because someone with power decided to make you feel that way. What would you do if your own mother, the woman who gave you life, looked you in the eyes and lied about you? Not behind your back, not in private, but right there in front of everyone you love, at a table full of siblings and cousins and grandchildren, just to make herself look generous and you look pathetic. Can you imagine spending 30 years building a life you're proud of, making sacrifices, working hard, paying every bill on your own, only to have someone erase all of it with one sentence, one lie, repeated so many times that even your own children started to believe it? That's exactly what happened to Patricia. She was 62 years old, a widow, a retired social worker, a mother and grandmother who had lived her entire life with dignity and independence, and on Christmas night in her billionaire mother's mansion, surrounded by crystal chandeliers and silver platters and a table that could seat 30 people, she was about to be humiliated in front of her entire family. Again. The dining room was breathtaking, the kind of wealth that makes ordinary people feel small. Vivian Brooks, 85 years old, sharp as a blade, billionaire matriarch, sat at the head of the table like a queen surveying her kingdom. She had built a real estate empire from nothing, and she never ever let anyone forget it. Patricia sat near the middle of the table, quiet, unassuming, surrounded by her 4 siblings, their spouses, their children, and their children's children. The annual Christmas ritual, the gathering where everyone came to pay tribute to Vivian's success, and where Patricia always felt like an outsider in her own family. The conversation had been flowing easily. Business deals, vacation homes, investment portfolios, the usual topics when billionaires gather for dinner. Then someone mentioned housing prices, and everything changed. Vivian set down her wine glass slowly, deliberately. Her eyes found Patricia across the table with the precision of a hawk spotting prey, and she smiled. That smile, the one that never quite reached her eyes, the one Patricia had learned to fear since childhood. "Speaking of houses," Vivian said, her voice cutting through the conversation like a knife, "Patricia, you're still living in that little place, aren't you? The one I bought for you all those years ago?" The table went quiet. Every single head turned toward Patricia. She felt her face grow hot. Her heart began to pound. Her hands trembled slightly under the table where no one could see. But she didn't speak. She couldn't. The words were stuck somewhere between her chest and her throat. Vivian continued, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "It must be nice, you know, never having to worry about a mortgage. Some of us had to actually work for what we have." A few chuckles rippled around the table. Patricia's brother Richard smirked. Her sister Caroline exchanged a knowing glance with her husband. The message was crystal clear. Patricia was the family charity case, the one who couldn't make it on her own, the disappointment who needed Mommy's money just to have a roof over her head. Patricia's daughter Elaine, sitting 2 seats away, leaned over and whispered, "Mom, just let it go. You know how she is." Let it go. Patricia had been letting it go for 30 years. She let it go when Vivian first started telling people she helped Patricia with her house. She let it go when helped with became paid for. She let it go when paid for became bought for her. She let it go when she confronted her mother privately years ago, and Vivian looked her dead in the eyes and said, "You're remembering wrong, Patricia. I don't know why you always have to be so difficult." She let it go when her siblings started repeating the lie, when her nieces and nephews grew up believing Aunt Patricia was the failure of the family, when even her own children began to wonder if maybe Grandma's version of events was true. She had spent decades letting it go, and look where it got her, sitting at this table, 62 years old, being publicly mocked by her own mother, while her grandchildren watched, while her children shifted uncomfortably, while everyone she loved either believed the lie or was too afraid to question it. But here's the thing. Here's what Vivian didn't know, what she had conveniently forgotten, or maybe deliberately erased from her memory. Patricia didn't receive that house as a gift. She bought it with her own money 30 years ago. She and her husband William had saved for years. They had sacrificed vacations and new cars and fancy dinners. They had taken out a mortgage and paid it off over 25 years, month by month, check by check, until the house was fully theirs. Vivian had offered to help once, just once, and Patricia had refused. She wanted to do it on her own. She needed to prove to herself and everyone else that she could build a life without her mother's money, and she did. But Vivian couldn't accept that. She couldn't accept that her middle daughter, the social worker, the one who married a teacher, the one who chose love over wealth, had actually succeeded on her own terms, without needing anything from the great Vivian Brooks. So she rewrote the story, and tonight she had pushed too far. Patricia looked around the table, at her smirking siblings, at her uncomfortable children, at her confused grandchildren who were hearing again that her grandmother was nothing but a charity case, and something inside her shifted. Something that had been quiet for 30 years finally woke up. She reached down slowly, carefully, and touched the purse sitting at her feet, the purse she had brought tonight for a very specific reason. Inside that purse was a folder, and inside that folder was the truth. 30 years of bank statements, canceled checks with her signature, mortgage documents with her name and William's name and no one else's. The deed to the house proving once and for all who really owned it. Every single receipt, every single payment, every piece of evidence that Vivian Brooks had been lying for 30 years. Patricia took a deep breath. She looked at her mother, this woman who had spent a lifetime making her feel small, dependent, worthless, and for the first time in 62 years, she decided she was done being quiet. What happened next would change everything. It would expose a lie that had poisoned her family for 30 years. It would shatter the image Vivian had carefully built for herself, and finally set Patricia free. But not before the most dramatic Christmas dinner this family had ever seen.
To really understand what happened that night, to understand why Patricia sat frozen at that table while her mother humiliated her, why her siblings smirked instead of defended her, why even her own children seemed unsure whose side to take, you need to go back to the beginning. Back to when Patricia was just a little girl, growing up in the shadow of a woman who measured love in dollars and success in status. Vivian Brooks wasn't born rich. She grew up poor in a small town, daughter of a factory worker and a seamstress who could barely keep food on the table. She clawed her way out of poverty with nothing but ambition and a ruthless determination to never, ever be poor again. By the time she was 30, she had started her first real estate company. By 40, she owned apartment buildings across 3 states. By 50, she was developing shopping malls and office complexes. And by 60, Vivian Brooks was a billionaire, a self-made billionaire who had built an empire from absolutely nothing. And she made sure everyone knew it. Every conversation eventually circled back to her success. Every family gathering included at least one story about how hard she had worked, how much she had sacrificed, how nobody had ever given her anything. She wore her wealth like armor and wielded it like a weapon. And she expected, no, demanded, that her children follow in her footsteps. There were 5 of them. Richard, the eldest, went to Harvard Business School and joined Vivian's company right after graduation. He was being groomed to take over the empire someday, and he never let anyone forget it. Caroline, the second child, married a hedge fund manager and sat on the boards of 3 different charities, not because she cared about the causes, but because it looked good in the society pages. The twins, David and Daniel, started their own investment firm with seed money from Vivian. They wore expensive suits and drove expensive cars and talked about money the way other people talk about the weather. And then there was Patricia, the middle child, the quiet one, the one who never quite fit in. From the time she was young, Patricia was different. She didn't care about business deals or stock portfolios. She didn't dream about corner offices or country club memberships. While her siblings competed for Vivian's approval by chasing wealth and status, Patricia wanted something else entirely. She wanted to help people. She wanted to make a difference in the world, not by writing checks, but by actually being there for people who were struggling. So, when it came time for college, Patricia didn't apply to business school. She studied social work. Vivian was furious. "Social work?" she had said, her voice dripping with contempt. "You want to waste your potential helping people who can't help themselves? You want to be poor for the rest of your life?" Patricia tried to explain. She tried to tell her mother that there were other ways to measure success, that helping a struggling family find housing or supporting a child through trauma was meaningful work, that she didn't need $1 billion to be happy. But Vivian didn't understand. She couldn't understand. In her world, there was only one metric that mattered: money. And Patricia's choice was, in Vivian's eyes, a rejection of everything she stood for. That was the first crack in their relationship. The second crack came when Patricia fell in love. His name was William. He was a high school history teacher. Kind, thoughtful, gentle, everything Vivian was not. He came from a middle-class family. His father was a postal worker. His mother was a nurse. He drove a 10-year-old Honda and lived in a small apartment filled with books. And Patricia loved him more than she had ever loved anyone in her life. When she brought William home to meet the family, Vivian barely spoke to him. Afterward, she pulled Patricia aside and said, "You can't be serious about this man. He's a teacher. He'll never be able to give you the life you deserve." Patricia looked at her mother and said, "He already gives me the life I deserve. He makes me happy." Vivian's face went cold. "Happy doesn't pay the bills, Patricia. Happy doesn't build empires. You're making a mistake." But Patricia didn't care. She married William in a small ceremony that Vivian barely attended. Her siblings came, but they spent most of the reception whispering amongst themselves about how Patricia was throwing her life away. That was 32 years ago. And for 32 years, Patricia and William built a life together. It wasn't a glamorous life. They never had a mansion or a yacht or a summer home in the Hamptons. William taught history at the same high school for 30 decades, shaping young minds, coaching the debate team, staying late to help struggling students. Patricia worked as a social worker, spending her days helping families in crisis, finding housing for the homeless, protecting children from abusive homes, connecting people with resources they desperately needed. So they drove used cars. They packed lunches instead of eating out. They skipped expensive vacations and spent summers camping in state parks or visiting William's parents in their modest home. And they saved. Every month, they put aside whatever they could. $100 here, $200 there. It wasn't much, but it added up, and when they finally had enough for a down payment, they bought their house. Their house. A small 3-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing fancy, but it was theirs. They signed the mortgage together, Patricia and William, their names on every document. They made the payments together, month after month, year after year. 25 years of sacrifice and discipline and doing without so they could build something that belonged to them. And when they finally made that last payment, when they held the deed in their hands, fully paid off, completely theirs, Patricia cried. Not because of the house itself, but because of what it represented. Independence, self-reliance, proof that she didn't need Vivian's money to survive, proof that she could build a good life on her own terms. But Vivian couldn't let that stand. It started small. A comment here, a remark there. I'm so glad I could help Patricia with her little house. Patricia heard it secondhand from a cousin, from an aunt, from a family friend who mentioned how generous Vivian had been. At first, Patricia ignored it. Maybe her mother was just confused. Maybe she genuinely misremembered. But the lie kept growing. Helped with became paid the down payment for. Paid the down payment for became bought for her. And eventually, it became the official family story. Patricia, the failure, the disappointment, couldn't afford a home on her own, so generous Vivian stepped in and bought it for her. Patricia confronted her mother once. Just once. It was at a family gathering about 15 years ago. She pulled Vivian aside and said, "Mother, why are you telling people you bought my house? You didn't. William and I bought it ourselves. You never gave us a cent." Vivian looked at her with those cold, calculating eyes and said, "Patricia, I don't know why you're being so dramatic. I clearly remember helping you with that house. You couldn't have afforded it otherwise. You must be remembering wrong." "I'm not remembering wrong. I have the mortgage documents. I have the canceled checks. I have—" "Enough." Vivian cut her off with a wave of her hand. "I'm not going to stand here and argue about ancient history. If you want to rewrite the past to make yourself feel better, that's your business. But I know what I did for you, and so does everyone else." And she walked away. That was the day Patricia learned an important lesson. In her family, truth didn't matter. Vivian's version of events was the only version that counted, because Vivian had the money, and money meant power, and power meant control over the narrative. After that, Patricia stopped fighting. She let the lies spread, she let her siblings believe it, she let her nieces and nephews grow up thinking Aunt Patricia was the charity case of the family. She even let her own children hear the story without correcting it, because every time she tried to explain, it sounded like she was making excuses, being defensive, causing drama. And Patricia hated drama. She hated conflict. She had spent her entire career helping other people resolve their problems, but when it came to her own family, she just retreated. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself she knew the truth, and that was enough. She told herself that fighting with Vivian was pointless, exhausting, a battle she could never win. So, she stayed quiet. For 15 years, she stayed quiet. And then, William died. It happened 5 years ago. A heart attack. Sudden, unexpected. One morning, he was there, making coffee, laughing at something on the news, and by that afternoon, he was gone. Patricia's world shattered. William was her partner, her best friend, her anchor. Without him, she felt lost, adrift, alone in a way she had never experienced. Her children, Elaine and Thomas, tried to help. They called every day, they visited when they could, but they had their own lives, their own families, their own responsibilities, and Patricia found herself spending more and more time alone in that house, the house that she and William had bought together, the house filled with memories of 30 years of marriage, the house that was supposed to be their forever home. Now, it just felt empty. And somehow, in the years since William's death, Vivian's lie had grown even more persistent. Without William there to back her up, Patricia felt even more powerless to correct the story. And her siblings, sensing her vulnerability perhaps, seemed to lean into it even harder. Every family gathering included at least one comment, one jab, one reminder that Patricia was the failure who needed mommy's help just to survive. Patricia's own children started to waver. She could see it in their eyes, the doubt, the uncertainty. They had heard Grandma's story so many times, and now that their father was gone, there was no one left to confirm her mother's version of events. Was it possible, they seemed to wonder, that Mom was remembering wrong? That maybe Grandma really did help with the house, and Mom just didn't want to admit it? That doubt, seeing it in her own children's eyes, was the deepest cut of all. But Patricia still didn't fight back. She didn't know how. She didn't have the energy. And honestly, part of her had started to wonder if it even mattered anymore. What was the point of fighting a battle she could never win? What was the point of challenging a woman who had all the money and all the power and all the family loyalty on her side? Maybe it was easier to just accept it, to let the lie become the truth, to spend her remaining years as the family disappointment, the charity case, the cautionary tale. Maybe that was just who she was now. That's what Patricia was thinking as she sat at that Christmas dinner table. That's the weight she was carrying when Vivian made her comment about the house I bought for you. That's why she almost did what she had always done. Stay quiet. Let it go. Swallow the humiliation and move on. But something was different this year. Maybe it was the way Vivian looked at her, with such open contempt, such obvious enjoyment of her discomfort. Maybe it was the smirks on her siblings' faces, so eager to pile on. Maybe it was watching her own grandchildren, innocent, confused, too young to understand, absorbing this lie as family truth. Or maybe it was simply that Patricia had finally, after 62 years, run out of silence. She thought about William, about what he would say if he were here, and she could almost hear his voice, gentle but firm. You've let her control the story long enough, Patricia. It's time to tell the truth. She reached down and touched the purse at her feet, the purse with the folder inside, the folder she had prepared weeks ago, just in case something like this happened. And for the first time in 30 years, Patricia decided to fight back. Now, you might be wondering, why didn't anyone at that table stand up for Patricia? Why didn't a single sibling, a single cousin, a single in-law say, "Wait a minute, Vivian, that doesn't sound right. Are you sure you bought Patricia's house?" Why did everyone just accept the lie without question? Why did they smirk and nod and pile on instead of defending their own sister? To understand that, you need to understand how the Brooks family really worked. Because on the surface, they looked like a picture-perfect wealthy family. Matching Christmas sweaters, professional family photos, donations to the right charities, appearances at the right events, children in the right schools. But underneath that polished exterior was something much darker. A family built not on love, but on dependency. Not on trust, but on transactions. And at the center of it all, pulling every string, controlling every move, was Vivian. You see, Vivian didn't just have money, she had leverage, and she used that leverage to keep every single member of the family exactly where she wanted them. Let's start with Richard, the eldest. Richard was the golden child, the heir apparent, the one who had followed Vivian's path most closely. He had an MBA from Harvard. He wore suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He drove a different luxury car every year. And he was absolutely, completely, utterly dependent on his mother. Oh, he had a fancy title at Vivian's company, executive vice president of something important, but everyone knew the truth. Richard didn't earn that position, he was handed it. And if Vivian ever decided to take it away, Richard would have nothing. No skills, no connections outside of his mother's orbit, no identity beyond Vivian Brooks's son. Richard knew this. Vivian knew this, and she reminded him of it constantly, not with words, but with looks, with subtle comments, with the ever-present threat of being replaced. So Richard did whatever Vivian wanted. He laughed at her jokes, he agreed with her opinions, and when she publicly humiliated Patricia, he smirked and joined in, because siding with Patricia meant risking his inheritance, and Richard wasn't about to risk a single dollar. Then there was Caroline. Beautiful, polished, perfectly put together Caroline. She had married well. A hedge fund manager named Gregory, who came from old money and made new money on top of it. On paper, Caroline didn't need Vivian's money. She had plenty of her own. But Caroline needed something else from her mother: validation. You see, Caroline had spent her entire life trying to be the perfect daughter, the perfect wife, the perfect hostess. She sat on charity boards, not because she cared about the causes, but because Vivian expected it. She threw dinner parties, not because she enjoyed them, but because Vivian measured her worth by her social calendar. Everything Caroline did was designed to earn her mother's approval, and Vivian knew it. She withheld that approval strategically, praising Caroline just enough to keep her trying, criticizing her just enough to keep her insecure. It was a masterful manipulation, and it worked. Caroline would never side with Patricia because that would mean risking her mother's approval, and approval for Caroline was more valuable than money. It was oxygen. It was survival. Next came the twins, David and Daniel. They were 48 years old, but they still acted like frat boys playing at being businessmen. Their investment firm, the one they bragged about constantly, had been started with Vivian's money. Not a small loan, millions of dollars in seed capital that they had never paid back. Every year, their firm somehow managed to stay afloat despite making decisions that would have bankrupted anyone else, and every year, Vivian quietly covered their losses. The twins didn't talk about this, of course. They preferred to act like self-made men, brilliant investors who had built their success from nothing. But everyone in the family knew the truth. Without Vivian's money, David and Daniel would be bankrupt within 6 months. So they laughed when she laughed, they mocked who she mocked, and when she called Patricia a charity case, they nodded along eagerly, probably grateful that the attention was on someone else's dependency for once. That was the family dynamic. 4 siblings, all bound to Vivian by invisible chains of money and approval. None of them would ever challenge her. None of them would ever risk their position by defending Patricia. Because in the Brooks family, loyalty was a luxury no one could afford. But what about Patricia's own children? What about Elaine and Thomas, who were sitting at that table watching their mother be humiliated? Why didn't they speak up? This is where the story gets even painful. Elaine was 38, a pediatrician with her own practice. Thomas was 35, an architect at a respected firm. They were good people, kind, hardworking, successful in their own right, and they loved their mother deeply. But they had also grown up hearing Vivian's story. Year after year, Christmas after Christmas, they had heard their grandmother talk about how she had helped Patricia with the house. They had heard their aunts and uncles make comments about how Patricia needed support, how she couldn't manage on her own, how Vivian was so generous to help. At first, they had believed their mother's version. Of course Mom and Dad bought the house themselves. Why would Grandma lie about something like that? But as the years went on and Vivian's story remained consistent while Patricia stayed quiet, doubt crept in. Maybe Mom was embarrassed to admit she needed help. Maybe she was remembering wrong. Maybe Grandma really did contribute and Patricia just didn't want to acknowledge it. After William died, that doubt grew stronger. Without their father there to confirm the truth, Elaine and Thomas found themselves caught between two versions of reality. Their mother said one thing, their grandmother, along with the entire rest of the family, said another. And their mother never fought back, never produced proof, never demanded to be believed. So what were they supposed to think? They didn't side with Vivian exactly, but they didn't side with Patricia either. They stayed neutral, silent, uncomfortable, hoping the conflict would just go away. And that silence, that careful, diplomatic silence, felt to Patricia like a betrayal. Her own children, the people she had raised, sacrificed for, loved more than life itself. Even they weren't sure if she was telling the truth. That hurt more than anything Vivian or her siblings could say. But there was one more layer to this family dynamic, one more reason why everyone accepted Vivian's version of events so easily. It wasn't just about money or approval, it was about what Patricia represented. You see, Patricia's choice to live differently, to reject wealth and status, to pursue meaningful work instead of profitable work, to marry for love instead of advantage, was a silent judgment on everyone else's choices. If Patricia could be happy without Vivian's money, what did that say about her siblings who had spent their entire lives chasing it? If Patricia could build a good life on a teacher's salary and a social worker's income, what did that say about Richard and Caroline and the twins who couldn't function without their mother's support? Patricia's independence was threatening. Her contentment was an accusation. Every time she showed up to family gatherings in her modest clothes, driving her sensible car, talking about her fulfilling work with a genuine smile on her face, she was holding up a mirror that nobody wanted to look at. So they tore her down. They called her the failure, the disappointment, the charity case. Because if Patricia was a failure, if she had needed Mommy's help just like everyone else, then their own dependency was normal, expected, nothing to be ashamed of. Vivian understood this instinctively. That's why she had created the lie in the first place, not just to make herself look generous, but to neutralize the threat that Patricia represented. As long as the family believed Patricia couldn't survive without help, they didn't have to question their own choices. They didn't have to wonder if maybe, just maybe, they had traded their freedom for money they didn't really need. The lie about the house wasn't just about a house. It was about control, about power, about keeping the entire family trapped in Vivian's orbit by making sure no one, especially Patricia, could be held up as an example of a different way to live. And it had worked. For 30 years, it had worked perfectly. Patricia was the family joke, the cautionary tale, the reminder of what happened when you didn't follow Vivian's rules. But tonight, something was about to change, because Patricia was finally ready to tell the truth. And once she did, everything the Brooks family believed about themselves, about each other, about success and failure, and what it really meant to live a good life was going to come crashing down. The question was, what would rise from the rubble? And would anyone have the courage to see Patricia, really see her, for who she actually was? Those answers were about to become very, very clear. The thing about moments that change your life is they never arrive with a warning label. They start small, with a comment, a glance, a sentence that lands just a little too hard. Patricia sat there, her mother's words still hanging in the air like smoke. "You're still living in that little place, aren't you? The one I bought for you all those years ago?" She could feel the heat spreading up her neck, into her cheeks. Shame has a way of making your whole body feel too tight, like your own skin doesn't quite fit. Part of her wanted to disappear, to fold in on herself, become invisible, let the moment pass the way she always had, swallow it, smile, change the subject. That was her role in this family. The quiet one, the peacekeeper, the one who didn't cause trouble. Vivian took a slow sip of wine, clearly pleased with the silence she'd created. Then she went in for the kill. "You know," she said, her voice light and conversational, as if she were commenting on the weather, "I've always been generous with my children, even the ones who didn't quite achieve as much as the others." A couple of people chuckled softly. Patricia's fork froze halfway to her mouth. Her stomach dropped. There it was, the label she'd worn her whole life, delivered as a joke. The one who didn't quite achieve as much. The failure. The disappointment. The cautionary tale. Across the table, Richard seized the opening like he always did. "That's true, Mother," he said, smiling, leaning back in his chair as if he were in on some private joke. "You've always taken care of Patricia. She should be more grateful." Children's laughter from the far end of the table suddenly sounded too loud, too bright, wrong against the dull roar inside Patricia's head. She watched her grandson, 8 years old, glance at her, confusion flickering across his face. His little brow furrowed as if trying to fit this image, Grandma as helpless charity case, with the woman who babysat him, cooked his favorite meals, helped him with homework. Her granddaughter beside him looked down at her plate, clearly embarrassed on Patricia's behalf without even understanding why. Caroline chimed in, her tone soft but patronizing, the way someone talks about a fragile relative who should be pitied rather than respected. "Some people just need more help than others," she said, placing a perfectly manicured hand over Vivian's. "There's no shame in it, Patricia. That's what family is for." No shame in it, but her eyes said something else. They said, "You are less than us. You are weaker. You couldn't do what we did." And Vivian let it happen. She sat there, soaking in the admiration, letting her children paint her as the benevolent savior, the generous matriarch who rescued her poor, incompetent daughter. Patricia's throat tightened. She tried to swallow, but her mouth was dry. Elaine leaned in again, voice a whisper meant only for Patricia. "Mom, seriously, just let it go, please." Let it go. Those 3 words had become the soundtrack of Patricia's life. Let it go when Vivian dismissed her career. Let it go when the lie about the house started. Let it go when her children began to question her version of events. Let it go when, after William's death, her siblings treated her like a fragile glass ornament instead of the woman who had held broken families together for decades in her work. How many years had she traded her own dignity for the illusion of peace? How many family gatherings had she walked away from feeling smaller, quieter, less real than when she arrived? How many times had she told herself it's not worth the fight, while something deep inside her withered a little more? Vivian wasn't finished. She never was. She turned slightly, addressing the table, but keeping her eyes locked on Patricia. "I remember when I bought that house for you," she said dreamily, as if recalling some fond memory. "You were so helpless, trying to make it on that tiny salary. I just couldn't stand to see you struggle like that. Mothers do what they must, after all." Helpless. The word hit Patricia like a slap. She saw flashes in her mind, William grading papers at the kitchen table late into the night, herself at the small desk in their bedroom balancing bills, stretching every dollar until it almost snapped. The 2 of them eating cheap pizza on the floor of their new house, sitting on boxes because they couldn't afford furniture yet, laughing anyway because it was theirs and they'd earned it. None of that existed in Vivian's story. In her version, Patricia had shown up with open hands and empty pockets, and Vivian had played the hero. Patricia gripped her napkin so tightly her knuckles went white. She could feel eyes on her now from every direction, some amused, some embarrassed for her, some curious to see if she would protest or stay in her place like she always did. Thomas, her son, shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. He looked at his mother, then at Vivian, then back again, as if weighing something inside himself he couldn't quite name. He opened his mouth slightly, then closed it again. A lifetime of family politics silenced him before the words could form. No one wanted to challenge the woman at the table. Vivian sensed the hesitation and pressed her advantage, a small, satisfied smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Of course, some of you took my example and built your own success. Richard with the company, the twins with their firm, Caroline with her charitable work. The pause on charitable was barely there, but Patricia caught it, a gentle reminder to Caroline that even her good deeds were only valuable because they reflected well on Vivian. And then, she continued, letting the silence stretch just long enough, there are those who simply weren't built for that kind of pressure. Her gaze never left Patricia's face. It was almost clinical, the way she watched the impact of her words land. Like a scientist observing an experiment, how far could she push before Patricia broke? Patricia's chest ached. There was a roaring in her ears now, like ocean waves crashing against rock. She barely tasted the food on her plate. Her hands had stopped shaking, but only because she'd gone numb. And beneath the numbness, something else was moving. Slow, deep, unfamiliar. Anger. Not the hot, explosive kind that burned out quickly. This was colder, heavier, older. It had been building for years, layer upon layer of swallowed words and smiled through insults, buried so deep she had almost convinced herself it wasn't there. Vivian leaned back, clearly enjoying herself. "But that's all right," she said lightly. "Not everyone is meant to be a leader. Some people are meant to be cared for. And I've always done my duty, haven't I, Patricia?" There it was, the final twist of the knife. Not only was Patricia a failure, she was a burden, a duty this great woman had nobly taken on. Patricia glanced around the table. No one would meet her eyes now. Richard was studying his wine glass, Caroline was adjusting her bracelet, the twins were whispering to each other, Elaine stared at her plate, jaw clenched. Thomas looked like he wanted to sink into the floor, and the grandchildren? They just looked confused. This, more than anything, made Patricia's stomach turn, because she could see it happening, the way this story was etching itself into their young minds. Years from now, they would remember this night. They would remember great-grandma Vivian talking about the house she bought for Grandma Patricia. They would remember the laughter, the way their own parents said nothing. And Patricia would be cemented in their memories as the weak one, the one who couldn't stand on her own 2 feet, the one who had to be saved. Was this really how she wanted to be remembered? Was this really the story she wanted told about her long after she was gone? A woman who had spent her entire life helping others regain her dignity, sitting silently while her own was stripped away? Patricia felt a sudden clarity cut through the fog of humiliation. A simple, undeniable truth. If she didn't speak now, she would never speak. If she didn't correct the story tonight, at this table, in front of every single person who had heard the lie, it would become permanent. It would become history, the official version written by the victor. And Vivian had been the victor for a long time. Her hand dropped from the napkin to the strap of her purse. She could feel the leather under her fingertips, smooth and solid. Inside, the folder waited. She had almost talked herself out of bringing it. It had felt paranoid, dramatic, unnecessary. But something in her, some small surviving spark of self-respect, had insisted. Just in case you couldn't swallow it anymore. Just in case there came a moment when staying silent hurt more than speaking up. That moment had arrived. Fear rose up in her chest, thick and suffocating. What if they didn't believe her, even with proof? What if they called her ungrateful, delusional, crazy? What if Vivian cut her off completely, banished her from the family, poisoned what little relationship she had left with her grandchildren? Then another question, quieter but stronger, surfaced underneath all the fear. What if you finally told the truth, and for once you believed yourself, even if no one else did? Vivian was still talking, basking in the attention, spinning her version of the past like a spider weaving silk. Patricia barely heard the words now. She was listening to something else, the steady beat of her own heart, the whisper of her own thoughts. You have the receipts. You have the truth. You have spent 62 years living by your mother's rules. How much longer are you willing to disappear so she
can feel big? Patricia straightened in her chair. Just a fraction. It was such a small movement, most people would have missed it. But Elaine noticed. Her eyes flicked up, surprise crossing her face. She could tell. Something was different. Patricia released the strap of her purse and placed her hands flat on the table, grounding herself. The room seemed to narrow, the noise fading until there was only Vivian's face and the dull roar of blood in Patricia's ears. She had two choices: walk out of this dinner the same way she always had, smaller, quieter, carrying the weight of another humiliation, or open her mouth and change the story, no matter what it cost. Her whole life she had been afraid of what would happen if she stood up to her mother. But in that moment, she realized there was something far worse than Vivian's rage, worse than being cut off, worse than being called ungrateful. The worst thing, she understood now, would be to reach the end of her life knowing she had never once defended it, never once stood up in a room full of people and said, "This is who I am. This is what I did. This is my truth." Patricia took a breath. Deep, steady, final. Then, for the first time in 30 years, she chose not to let it go. She lifted her eyes, met Vivian's gaze head-on, and opened her mouth to speak.
"Actually," Patricia said, and even she was surprised by how steady her voice sounded, "that's not what happened." The words dropped into the center of the table like a stone into still water. Conversation died instantly. Forks paused midair. The soft clinking of glasses, the quiet chatter from the far end, even the children's laughter seemed to dim all at once. For a second, no one moved. No one breathed. Patricia felt 100 eyes shift toward her, the way they always did when Vivian decided to make her the evening's entertainment. But this time was different. They weren't waiting to see how she would endure it. They were waiting to see why she had dared to speak. Vivian's smile froze. It was such a small change, a slight tightening at the corners of her mouth, a narrowing of her eyes, but Patricia saw it. She had spent her life studying that face, reading the weather of her mother's moods like survival depended on it, because it did. "Excuse me?" Vivian said softly, her tone deceptively mild. That was her dangerous voice, the one she used right before she destroyed someone. Patricia's heart hammered in her chest, but the fear that had held her hostage for decades was now tangled with something else, a deep, weary certainty. "You heard me," she said, and this time her voice was stronger. "You didn't buy my house." A murmur rippled through the table, like a gust of wind rustling through leaves. Richard actually laughed, a short, incredulous sound. "Patricia," he said, shaking his head, "what are you talking about? We've all heard the story 1,000 times. Mother bought you that house because you couldn't afford it. You've said yourself how grateful you are." Patricia turned her head slowly, looking at her brother. "No," she said calmly, "I haven't. I've never said that, because it isn't true." Caroline let out a soft, disbelieving gasp. "Patricia," she said, her voice slipping into that familiar, condescending tone, "why are you doing this? No one's judging you. There's nothing wrong with needing help. We all know Mother stepped in. She's told us the story for years." That was the problem, Patricia thought. Mother had told the story for years, and every time she told it, the lie sank deeper into the foundation of their family history, until it might as well have been carved into stone. She could feel Elaine's eyes on her, sharp and worried. "Mom," Elaine whispered again, this time more urgent. "Please, not tonight. This isn't worth it." Not worth it. The words almost hooked into Patricia's resolve, tried to pull her back into the old pattern. But then she looked up and caught her grandson watching her closely, his little face serious, trying to figure out what was happening. She saw her granddaughter's cheeks flushed with secondhand shame, and she knew if she backed down now, those children would carry this version of her, the weak, helpless, delusional woman who couldn't even keep her own memory straight for the rest of their lives. Was protecting Vivian's comfort really worth sacrificing her own truth forever? "It is worth it," Patricia said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. Then she lifted her chin and faced the head of the table again. "Mother," she said, using the formal word deliberately, putting distance where once had been longing. "You did not buy my house. William and I bought that house 30 years ago. We took out a mortgage, we made every payment, we paid it off after 25 years. You didn't contribute a single dollar." The silence that followed was different now, sharper, curious, unsettled. It was the sound of a story being challenged for the first time in decades. Vivian's expression hardened, the charm slipping. "Patricia," she said slowly, enunciating each syllable like a warning, "I don't know what you're trying to do here, but I will not be called a liar at my own table." There it was, the line no one ever crossed. Calling Vivian a liar was like calling a storm wet. Accurate, but dangerous. "Then don't lie," Patricia said. The words stunned even her. She had never spoken to her mother like that, not once. A low collective inhale swept around the table. It was as if everyone had just watched someone step on thin ice over a deep lake, waiting to see if it would crack. Vivian's eyes flashed. "I remember helping you with that house. You couldn't have afforded it otherwise. You were working that little social work job. He was teaching. You were barely scraping by." Patricia felt a flicker of the old doubt, the gaslighting that had worn grooves in her mind over the years. What if they still didn't believe her? What if she sounded unhinged, arguing against a narrative everyone else accepted as fact? How many times had she replayed that old conversation in her head, the one where Vivian told her she was remembering wrong, until Patricia almost believed it herself? How many times had she thought, maybe I'm crazy, maybe I misread it, maybe I should just drop it? But she hadn't dropped it. Not really. She hadn't been able to, because some part of her, some quiet, stubborn part, had refused to surrender her own memory, her own reality, that completely. That's why the folder existed, why she had spent an entire afternoon digging through old boxes, opening envelopes that still smelled faintly of paper and dust and years gone by, why she had carefully placed each document in order, her hands shaking not from age, but from the enormity of what she was preparing to do. "I remember," Patricia said now, and her voice didn't shake at all. "I remember sitting at a tiny kitchen table with William, going over our budget line by line to see if we could afford the mortgage payment. I remember skipping vacations, driving that old Honda until it died on the side of the road. I remember writing every check myself, watching our account balance dip and climb for 25 years. I remember the day we made the last payment." Her eyes stung, but she didn't look away. "I remember because it was one of the proudest days of my life." Something flickered in Elaine's expression then. Confusion, maybe, or pain. Thomas was staring at his mother like he was seeing her for the first time. Richard snorted. "Patricia, honestly, this is ridiculous. You really want us to believe that Mother just made this up? That she imagined paying for your house out of thin air? She's told the same story since I can remember." "Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying." So we're all wrong and you're right? All of us have been listening to the same story for 30 years, but somehow you are the only one with the real version? Don't you think that sounds a little convenient? There it was again, that subtle accusation she'd lived under for so long. The idea that her truth was less valid because it was only hers, because she didn't have the money, the influence, the echo chamber to back it up. But this time she did have something even Vivian couldn't dismiss as salty memory. Patricia slid one hand down, and without letting herself hesitate, she lifted her purse into her lap. Her fingers found the zipper. The sound it made as she pulled it open seemed unnaturally loud, slicing through the tense stillness. A few people frowned, exchanging looks. Vivian's eyes narrowed. "What are you doing?" demanded Vivian. "You say you remember," she said quietly. "Well, so do I. And I decided that this Christmas I was tired of everyone acting like my memory doesn't count." She reached in and pulled out the folder. Plain, manila, unremarkable, except for the way the air in the room seemed to change as soon as it appeared. It was like someone had cracked a window in a tightly sealed room. "What is that?" one of the twins asked, half amused, half uneasy. Patricia laid the folder carefully on the white tablecloth, right in the center of the table, between the crystal centerpiece and the silver serving dishes. For a moment, no one moved. The absurdity of it struck her. Mortgage documents and bank statements sharing space with carved turkey and fine china. Two very different kinds of nourishment, laid out side by side. "These," Patricia said clearly for everyone to hear, "are my memories, on paper." She looked straight at Vivian. 30 years of bank statements, every mortgage payment William and I ever made, canceled checks with my signature, the original mortgage, the final deed, all with my name on them. Your name is nowhere. A visible shiver ran through the room, as if a cold wind had slipped under the door. One of the younger cousins leaned forward unconsciously, eyes wide. A couple of in-laws straightened in their chairs. Even the teenagers stopped scrolling on their phones. "Patricia," Vivian scoffed, but there was a new edge to it now. Not confidence, but something closer to fear. "Do you really think waving some ancient paperwork around is going to change what happened?" Patricia didn't answer her directly. Instead, she looked around the table, meeting as many eyes as she could. "You've all heard the story," she said. "Mother bought me my house because I couldn't afford it. You've heard it so many times you don't even question it anymore."
Her gaze landed on Elaine, then Thomas. "Some of you grew up believing it." She rested her fingertips lightly on the folder. "But this is what actually happened. Not her version, not mine, just the facts." There was a beat of stillness, heavy and expectant. Then Patricia nudged the folder forward until it sat directly in the center of the table, like an uninvited guest. "Would anyone like to see?" she asked. It was a challenge and an invitation all at once. No yelling, no accusations, just a quiet dare to look at the truth. Richard was the first to move, of course, he always was. He reached across the table, his hand just a little too quick, a little too eager, as if he were grabbing a document in a boardroom. "Fine," he said with a forced chuckle. "Let's settle this nonsense so we can get back to dinner." Vivian didn't stop him, but Patricia saw the way her mother's jaw clenched, the way one hand tightened imperceptibly around the stem of her wineglass. For the first time all evening, she looked nervous. As Richard flipped open the folder, the entire table seemed to lean in, some physically, others just with their attention. It felt like the room was holding its breath. Have you ever had a moment like that, where your whole life, your whole story hangs in the balance of what someone is about to read? Where 30 years of being doubted and dismissed come down to a few pieces of paper and whether anyone will let themselves believe them? Patricia sat very still. Her hands were in her lap now, safely away from the trembling documents. Her work was done. She had brought the receipts, she had spoken her truth out loud. Now all that was left was to watch what her family would do with it. Richard's eyes skimmed the first page, then the second. His smirk slid slowly from his face. His eyebrows pulled together. He flipped to another document, then another, his movements growing faster, less confident. A long, brittle silence stretched over the table as everyone waited for his verdict. Finally, someone, one of the nieces, whispered, "Uncle Richard, what does it say?" He didn't answer right away, because for the first time in his life, faced with actual proof against his mother's story, he wasn't sure what to say at all. Richard cleared his throat, but his usual confidence was gone. He started, then stopped. His eyes darted from the page to Patricia, then to Vivian, as if searching for a script that wasn't there. He picked up one of the sheets and held it closer to the candlelight. "This is," he said finally, sounding more like a confused intern than the heir to a billion-dollar empire, "from 30 years ago." He flipped to another. Another statement, same bank, same address. He pulled out a check copy, his jaw tightening. And this is a canceled check from Patricia's account to the bank. Someone at the far end of the table let out a low "oh." Just that one syllable, but it carried years of doubt and disbelief cracking open. "What else is there?" one of the twins asked, his voice sharper now, more anxious than amused. Richard rifled through the stack, his hands moving faster. "It's all like this," he muttered. "Mortgage documents, payment records. Look." He turned a page around so the people next to him could see. "Her name is on the loan, hers and William's. No mention of mother." Elaine reached out suddenly. "Let me see." Her voice was steady, but her fingers trembled as she took the paper. She scanned it, her brows knitting together, lips moving silently as she read. Then she picked up another page, and another. With each one, the color drained slightly from her face. "Mom," she said softly, looking up, and in that one word was a lifetime of questions, of half-formed doubts, of stories that had never quite sat right. Thomas leaned over her shoulder. He didn't even ask permission. He just reached for one of the documents like a drowning man grabbing a life preserver. "This is your signature?" he said, staring at the check. "That's our old address." He turned to his mother, eyes wide. You kept all of this?" Patricia nodded once. "Every single one." Have you ever watched someone realize in real time that the story they've believed their whole life might be wrong? That a person they trusted, maybe even admired, has been lying to them for years? You could see it wash over the table, face by face, like a slow spreading dawn. The cousins whispering, "Wait, so Grandma didn't..." The in-laws exchanging looks that said, "We always wondered, but we never dared say it." Caroline reached for the folder, almost reluctantly, as if touching it would make something irreversible. She skimmed a page, then another, her mouth pressing into a thin line. "Well," she said finally, but her voice lacked its usual certainty. "Paperwork doesn't prove everything. Maybe Mother paid you back in cash, or helped with the down payment off the record. That wouldn't show up in a bank statement." It was a lifeline, thrown not to Patricia, but to Vivian, a desperate attempt to keep the old version afloat. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the soft clink of a spoon falling against a plate at the far end. Then Elaine shook her head slowly. "Aunt Caroline," she said quietly, "this is 25 years of payments, every month, for decades. If Grandma had paid the down payment, wouldn't there be something? A transfer? A note? Anything?" She turned to Vivian. "Grandma." That single word, not mother, not Vivian, but grandma, landed differently. It wasn't just a daughter challenging her mother, it was a granddaughter asking the matriarch of the family to explain herself. Vivian set her wine glass down with deliberate care. Her face was pale now, the carefully curated poise slipping at the edges, but her eyes were still hard. I don't see why I should have to defend my generosity, she said. I remember helping Patricia with that house. I remember it perfectly. If she chose not to tell you children how much I did for her, that's hardly my fault. There it was, the pivot. If the lie was exposed, then the problem wasn't the lying, it was Patricia's alleged ingratitude. Mother, Patricia said, and this time there was steel under the word, you didn't help us. Not with the house, not with a single payment, not with the down payment, nothing. She gestured toward the documents. This isn't about generosity. This is about you taking credit for something you didn't do and rewriting my life to make me look weak. Oh, listen to yourself. Rewriting your life. Honestly, Patricia, you've always been so dramatic. I told a few people I helped you. That's hardly a crime. You didn't say you helped, Patricia said, her voice rising for the first time. You said you bought my house. You told my children that. You told my nieces and nephews that. You told anyone who would listen that their poor, pathetic sister couldn't afford a home, so you swooped in and rescued her. She looked around the table, making sure to meet as many eyes as she could. How many of you heard her say that? That she bought my house? Hands didn't go up. This wasn't a courtroom, but you didn't need them to. You could see it in the stiff shoulders, the averted gazes, the guilty glances. One of the younger cousins murmured, "She said it to my parents, lots of times." Another added, "Yeah, mine too. It was like a family story." A family story. That phrase lodged in Patricia's chest like a splinter. This was what passed for history in the Brooks family. Not truth, not memory, but whatever narrative made Vivian look powerful and everyone else look dependent. See? Vivian said sharply, seizing on the word. Exactly. A story. Families tell stories. Maybe I exaggerated. Maybe the details blurred over time. But I certainly remember offering to help you, Patricia. I remember... No, Patricia cut in. You offered to help once, and I said no. A few people blinked at that. They hadn't heard that part before. Why on earth would you say no to free money? One of the twins muttered, baffled. Patricia almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. Because, she said, if I took your money, Mother, it would never really be mine. The house, my life, any of it. It would always belong to you. Have you ever had to explain a choice that made perfect sense to your soul to people who only measure worth in dollars? Patricia took a breath. William and I wanted to do it ourselves. We knew it would be hard. We knew we'd have to give things up. But we wanted to know that when we turned that key in the front door, it was because of our sacrifices, our work, not your checkbook. She turned to her children then, her eyes shimmering but clear. I didn't want you growing up thinking the only way to get anywhere in life is to have someone bail you out. Elaine's face crumpled slightly, realization and regret warring in her expression. Mom, why didn't you ever tell us all of this? Patricia smiled sadly. I tried a few times, but every time I did, it sounded like I was attacking your grandmother or making excuses, and I was tired, so tired. It was easier to let you believe her version and just carry the truth quietly. She wiped at one eye, annoyed at the tear. That was my mistake. Thomas shook his head, his voice rough. No, your mistake was trusting that we'd question things, that we'd see you. He looked down at the documents in front of him, then at his mother. You didn't want us? The shift in a room was almost physical now. You could feel the center of gravity moving, tilting away from Vivian's end of the table for the first time anyone could remember. Richard seemed to sense it too, and panic crept into his voice. All right, enough. So maybe Mother remembered wrong about a few details. Does it really matter who paid for one little house? Look around you. He gestured broadly at the chandeliers, the art on the walls, the sprawling room. Everything we have is because of her. You're really going to tear this family apart over a mortgage from the 90s? Have you ever noticed how people who benefit from a lie always want to talk about not making a big deal out of things? It's not about the house, Patricia said quietly, and somehow her soft voice cut through Richard's bluster more sharply than if she had shouted. It's about what the house represented, to me, and to all of you. She looked at her siblings. Really looked at them. The expensive clothes, the carefully maintained faces, the subtle signs of anxiety that money couldn't quite disguise. You needed me to be the one who failed, she said, not unkindly, just honestly. Because if I didn't fail, if I chose a different kind of life and it still worked, then what did that say about your choices, about everything you sacrificed to be exactly what Mother wanted? A harsh silence fell. Someone's fork scraped against a plate and made everyone jump. Caroline bristled. So now we're the bad guys because we chose success? No, Patricia said. You're not bad. You're just scared, the same way I was. Scared of losing her approval. Scared of being cut off. She gestured toward the folder again. The difference is, I was willing to lose it. I was willing to be poor in your eyes.
To live a life that felt honest to me. But that terrified all of you. So it was easier to believe that I couldn't have done it without her, that no one could. Her gaze shifted to Vivian, the woman who had shaped every corner of this family's universe with her money and her fear. You lied, Patricia said simply. For 30 years, you lied. You told everyone that I couldn't survive without you when you knew that wasn't true. You took the one thing I was most proud of, the home William and I built together, and you claimed it as your gift. Vivian's lips pressed together so tightly they almost disappeared. I gave you life, she hissed. I gave you everything. You gave me life, Patricia agreed, and then you spent the rest of my life acting like that meant you owned me. Her voice didn't rise, but it deepened, rich with something that had been waiting decades to be spoken. You couldn't stand that I walked away, that I built something outside your control, so you dragged me back into your story any way you could, even if you had to rewrite the past to do it. Vivian's hand slammed down on the table, making several glasses rattle. How dare you, she snapped. How dare you stand there and talk to me like this after everything I've done? I built this family from nothing. I clawed my way out of poverty so none of you would ever have to know what it felt like. And this is the thanks I get? Accusations? Ungrateful children? She swept her arm toward the rest of them. You hear her? This is what happens when you let people forget where they came from. Have you ever noticed how people like Vivian always make your boundaries feel like betrayal? Patricia didn't flinch. Mother, she said quietly, I have spent my entire life being grateful for things I never asked you for. Grateful for wealth I didn't touch. Grateful for a status I never wanted. She placed a hand over her heart. But I will not be grateful for a lie. Not anymore. Her eyes moved back to the others. You want to know what I'm actually grateful for? I'm grateful for every night William and I sat at that kitchen table wondering if we could make the numbers work, and somehow we did.
I'm grateful for every cheap vacation, every second-hand couch, every old car that broke down, because they're all part of the story of how we made it on our own." Her voice softened. "I'm grateful that when my husband died, I could sit in that house and really know that we had built it ourselves, that every brick, every board, every memory inside those walls belonged to us." She took a breath. "And I am grateful right now that I finally found the courage to stop letting you tell my story for me." A hush fell so thick you could almost feel it on your skin. Vivian stared at her, something raw and ugly flickering across her face. Not just anger, but something closer to panic, because for the first time, she could feel control slipping through her fingers. Someone, an in-law who had married into the family and never quite drunk the Kool-Aid, cleared his throat. "Vivian," he said carefully, If you remember things differently, that's one thing, but these papers are pretty clear. Maybe it's time to admit that you exaggerated and to apologize." The word apologize landed like a gunshot. Vivian recoiled as if struck. "I have nothing to apologize for. If anyone deserves an apology, it's me for being attacked in my own home on Christmas." She pushed back her chair slightly, her breathing shallow. "I opened my doors to you people. I shared my table, and this is what I get?" "Mother," Richard said quickly, seeing where this was heading, "you don't have to—" Patricia cut him off gently. "You're right about one thing," she said to Vivian. "This is your home, your table, your kingdom." She gestured at the glittering room, the towering tree, the lavish spread. "You built all of this. No one's taking that away from you." Then she straightened in her chair, and in that moment, in that posture, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, she looked more like a matriarch than Vivian ever had. "But my life," she continued, "my choices, my marriage, my house, those are mine. You don't get to own those. Not with money, not with stories, not with lies repeated until everyone's too scared to question them." She glanced once more at the folder, now splayed open like a wound in the center of the table. "You've all seen the truth now," she said to the room. "What you choose to do with it is up to you. Keep believing the lie if that feels safer. Pretend you never saw any of this. Or start asking yourself how many other things in this family are just stories she liked better than the truth." The words hung there, heavy and electric. You could see them landing, lodging, taking root. How many other lies? How many other stories? The chandelier lights seemed suddenly too bright, the room too exposed. People shifted in their chairs, not sure where to look, what to say. For the first time in decades, the Brooks family had no script. Patricia let the silence stretch. Let them feel it, the discomfort, the uncertainty, the possibility. Then she placed her napkin gently on the table and pushed her chair back with a soft scrape against the polished floor. She had lit the fuse. The explosion and the rebuilding would come next.
For a heartbeat, no one moved. It was as if the air in the room had turned to glass, fragile, dangerous, one wrong word away from shattering completely. Patricia stood slowly, the muscles in her legs stiff from sitting too long in a chair that had never really felt like it belonged to her. Her napkin lay folded neatly on the table, a small white flag that did not, for once, mean surrender. Every instinct she'd been trained into since childhood screamed at her to sit back down, to apologize, to laugh it off as a misunderstanding, to smooth things over so everyone else could feel comfortable again. That was what she did. That was who she'd always been in this family, the one who absorbed the blows so no one else had to. But tonight, the cost of that role finally felt too high. "Where are you going?" Vivian demanded, her voice sharp, cutting through the silence. Patricia turned to her mother, really looking at her. The carefully set hair, the expensive jewelry, the woman who had survived poverty and built an empire, only to recreate the same hunger for control in a gilded cage. "Home," Patricia said simply. That one word seemed to ring in the air. Not leaving, not outside. Home. The house at the center of this entire war, the one she had bought, paid for, sacrificed for. The space that had been turned into a weapon against her and was now, finally, about to become what it always should have been, her sanctuary. Elaine shot to her feet. "Mom, wait," she said, stepping around her chair, voice thick. "You don't have to—" Patricia reached for her daughter's hand and squeezed it gently. "I do," she said. "I should have done this a long time ago." Thomas stood too, coming around the other side. Without a word, he placed himself just slightly between Patricia and the rest of the table, a small, instinctive act of protection he probably didn't even realize he was making. The grandchildren looked between the adults, eyes wide, suddenly sensing this wasn't just another tense family moment that would blow over. This was different, final. "Sit down," Vivian snapped, not to Patricia, to Elaine and Thomas. "This conversation isn't over." Elaine turned to her grandmother, and for the first time in her life, there was something new in her expression. Disappointment. "Actually," she said quietly, echoing her mother's word from earlier, "I think it is, at least for tonight." You could have heard a pin drop. No one spoke to Vivian like that. Not her children, certainly not her grandchildren. Vivian's eyes flashed. "If you walk out that door with her," she said, her voice low and trembling with fury, "you are choosing sides. Do you understand me? You will be out of this family, out of my will, out of everything I've built." There it was, the nuclear threat, the thing that had kept everyone in line for decades. Exile, financial, emotional, social. The fear of being cut off from the empire. Patricia felt a strange, almost surreal calm settle over her. This was the monster under the bed they'd all been hiding from. Dragged into the light, it didn't look as big as she had imagined. "Mother," Patricia said, "I was never in your will." Vivian blinked, thrown for the first time. "Don't be ridiculous," she snapped. "Of course you were. All my children." "No," Patricia interrupted gently. "You made it very clear years ago that everything would go to the ones who helped build the empire." She glanced at Richard, at the twins, at Caroline. "I accepted that. I made my peace with it. I didn't agree with it, but I understood. You don't owe me your money. You never did." She spread her hands slightly. "I have never asked you for a cent. Not when we were struggling, not when William died, not now. So, if you want to threaten to cut me off from something I was never part of, go ahead. It doesn't mean anything." You could feel the tremor that ran through the room at those words. It wasn't just defiance, it was freedom, the kind none of them, except for Patricia, had ever really tasted. Vivian's face went slack for a moment, then hardened. "You ungrateful—" "I'm not ungrateful. I'm just done paying for something I never bought." She let that sink in, the double meaning of it. The house, the story, the role. All of it. She looked down at her grandchildren, who were now standing, chairs half pushed back, clinging to Elaine's skirt and Thomas's hand. "You want to come with Grandma?" she asked softly. 4 small eyes stared up at her. They didn't understand the details, but they understood enough. Grandma was leaving, and they loved her. "Yes," her granddaughter whispered first, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. Her grandson nodded hard, his lower lip wobbling. "I don't like it here," he blurted out, too loud in the quiet room. "Everyone's mad." A ripple of uncomfortable amusement spread down the table, quickly smothered. Patricia's chest ached. "Okay," she said, her voice gentle but sure. "Let's go home." Elaine looked at her brother. Thomas looked at Elaine. Then, slowly, deliberately, they both turned their backs on the table, on the chandeliers and crystal and portraits of Vivian in various stages of success, and moved to stand fully at Patricia's side. They had chosen. Not money, not power, not the story they'd been fed their whole lives. Her. "If you walk out that door," Vivian repeated, her voice rising, "don't you dare come crawling back when you realize what you've thrown away. There will be no forgiveness. Do you understand? None." Patricia paused at the threshold of the dining room and turned back one last time, not because she doubted her choice, but because goodbyes, even to things that have hurt you, deserve to be witnessed. "I do understand. Finally." She inhaled, filling her lungs with air that suddenly tasted clearer. "I understand that I have spent 62 years trying to earn something you were never capable of giving me. Not really." Vivian scoffed, but there was a tremor in it now. "And what is that, exactly?" "Respect," Patricia said simply. "The kind that doesn't come with conditions or price tags." She looked down at her brothers and sisters, her voice softening. "I hope for your sakes you find that for yourselves someday, with or without her." It wasn't an accusation, it was almost a blessing, a hope for their freedom too, even if they weren't ready to take it. Then she glanced at the folder on the table, still open, still undeniable. "Keep those," she said, "in case anyone ever wonders what else they might have been wrong about." With that, she turned and walked out of the room. The sound of their footsteps, hers steady, Elaine's and Thomas's close behind, the quick, uneven patter of small shoes, echoed down the polished hallway. No one followed, no one tried to stop them. Behind them, the dining room erupted in a low, chaotic hum, voices overlapping, questions spilling out. "Did you know? Do you think? She can't really?" All swirling around the one person who suddenly found herself on the wrong side of the story, Vivian. "Sit down," she snapped at someone. "We're not done." But the authority wasn't as absolute as it had been an hour ago. You could hear it in the way the responses came back, hesitant, uncertain, no longer drenched in automatic obedience. As Patricia stepped out into the cold December night, the icy air hit her face like a baptism. She exhaled, watching her breath rise in front of her like smoke, like something leaving her body after being trapped for too long. "Mom," Elaine said quietly as they made their way to the car, "I had no idea about any of it." Patricia glanced at her, then at her two sons. Both of them looked shattered and awake at the same time, like people who just walked out of a long, strange dream. "I know," Patricia said. "There was no anger in it, just truth. You believed what you were told. You were kids, and then you were busy being adults. You trusted the person who told the story the loudest." She unlocked the car, helped the grandchildren climb in, buckled them in with hands that had soothed more children than she could count over the years. Her own, other people's. Children from homes far more visibly broken than this expensive one. Then she turned back to her son and daughter. "But now you've seen the receipts," she said quietly. "Not just on paper, in me." Elaine's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry I ever doubted you," she whispered. "I should have asked more questions. I should have pushed back. It was easier not to." "I know," Patricia repeated. She reached out, cupping Elaine's cheek in one hand, Thomas's shoulder in the other. "We all do that sometimes. Go along with the story because it feels safer than challenging it. What matters is what you do after you know better." Thomas swallowed hard. "We're here," he said. "We're with you, from now on." Patricia smiled then, not the polite, tight smile she wore at family functions, but something softer, real. "That's all I need." They drove home in near silence, the kind that isn't empty but full of thought, of recalibration, of the slow rebuilding of trust. The house was dark when they pulled up, but as soon as Patricia unlocked door and stepped inside. A wave of something warm and aching washed over her. The familiar creak in the hallway, the faint scent of old books and laundry detergent, the slightly crooked picture frame William had hung himself and never quite fixed. This was hers. The grandchildren ran in first, racing to the living room, their voices bouncing off walls that had heard laughter and arguments and bedtime stories and whispered prayers. Elaine and Thomas followed more slowly, looking around with new eyes, taking in the details they'd always taken for granted. "It's smaller than Grandma's," Elaine said softly, "but it feels bigger somehow." Patricia chuckled, a little startled by the sound. "That's what happens," she said, "when a place isn't built to impress anyone, just to hold a life." They made hot chocolate in mismatched mugs. The kids changed into the extra pajamas Patricia kept in the guest room, just in case. They all ended up in the living room, on the slightly sagging couch and the old armchair that had a permanent indentation in the cushion where William used to sit. For a while, they didn't talk about what had happened. They just existed together, the four of them, in the house that had survived everything. Tight budgets, teenage tantrums, grief, now this. Then, slowly, the words came. Questions, apologies, stories. Patricia told them about the day she and William first saw the house, how the realtor had tried to talk them into something more realistic, but they'd fallen in love with the crooked porch and the overgrown backyard. She told them about the years they'd struggled to make the mortgage, the nights she'd lain awake wondering if they'd made a terrible mistake, the pride she'd felt each time they managed another payment anyway. Elaine and Thomas listened like they were hearing a legend, not because it was grand, but because it was finally, the unfiltered truth. "I wish Dad were here," Thomas said quietly at one point. Patricia's throat tightened. "He is," she said, looking around the room. "Everywhere. In the handprints still faintly visible on the hallway wall from some long-ago art project. In the dent on the coffee table where he'd dropped a heavy book and they'd all laughed. In the steady, invisible foundation of this house that had held even when their lives had cracked." As the night wore on and the grandchildren finally fell asleep on the couch, curled up against Patricia's side, Elaine looked at her mother and said, "Do you think they'll call the others?" Patricia sighed, leaning her head back. "Some of them will, eventually. Curiosity, guilt, maybe even love under all the other stuff." She thought of Richard, clinging to his title, of Caroline, clinging to approval, of the twins clinging to the illusion of independence. "Some won't," she added. "It's hard to question the story you've built your whole life on, especially when that story comes with a very comfortable lifestyle." "And Grandma?" Thomas asked. Patricia paused. She pictured Vivian sitting at the head of that long table, rage and fear fighting for control on her face, everyone else's voices crowding around her, no longer perfectly in sync. "She won't apologize," Patricia said finally. "She might double down, rewrite this too into a story where she's the victim. That's who she is. I can't change that." She looked at her children, her voice soft but certain. "But I also don't have to live under it anymore." That was the real resolution. Not a dramatic reconciliation, not a complete severing either. Just stepping out from under someone else's shadow and letting whatever remained of the relationship exist in the light, if it could survive there. In the weeks that followed, Patricia's prediction turned out to be right. 2 of her siblings called, tentatively at first. "How are you?" That was something, huh? Then slowly, more honestly, "I'm sorry. I should have said something years ago." I believed her because it was easier. One niece sent a long, tearful email apologizing for all the time she joked about Aunt Patricia being Grandma's charity case. One of the twins never reached out at all. Richard sent a terse message about regrettable scenes and protecting Mother from further distress, which Patricia deleted halfway through reading. Caroline invited her to lunch to clear the air, then spent the entire time talking about how hard it was for her to be caught in the middle, never once acknowledging that there was even a middle to be caught in. And Vivian, she sent nothing. No apology, no explanation, no attempt at reconciliation. Word trickled back through the family grapevine that she'd started telling a new story about how Patricia had always been difficult, how she'd twisted things, how some people can't handle the truth when it doesn't flatter them. But this time, the story didn't take hold quite as easily, because now, whenever someone heard it, they also remembered the sight of that manila folder on the Christmas table, the look on Richard's face as he read, the way Elaine and Thomas had stood up, the way Patricia had walked out, not broken, but whole. The next Christmas, there was no invitation to the mansion. There was no need. Patricia woke up in her own bed, in her own house, to the sound of her grandchildren's feet thundering down the hallway and the smell of slightly burnt cinnamon rolls, Thomas's attempt at breakfast. Elaine fussed with the tree lights, complaining good-naturedly about the old wiring. They all opened presents in the living room, wrapping paper everywhere, hot chocolate spilling on the rug, laughter bouncing off the walls like it had been waiting to be that loud. At one point, as she watched her family, her real family, the one built not on fear or obligation, but on choice and effort and love, Patricia felt a familiar ache in her chest. The old fear, the old question, had she done the right thing? Then her granddaughter climbed into her lap, resting her head against Patricia's shoulder. "Grandma?" she said. "Yeah, sweetheart? I like this Christmas better than the other ones." Patricia smiled into her hair, breathing in the scent of kid shampoo and sugar. "Me too," she whispered. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt completely, quietly, undeniably free. Some families are held together by love, others by fear. And sometimes you don't realize which one you grew up in until you finally step outside of it. Patricia spent most of her life thinking she was the weak one, the disappointment, the child who didn't quite achieve as much as the others. That was the role she'd been assigned. So she did what so many of us do. She tried to wear it quietly, politely, without making trouble. She kept her head down, she let the jokes slide, she let the lies go unchallenged, because the price of peace, even fake peace, felt easier than the cost of confrontation. And if you've ever swallowed your own truth at a family table just to keep everyone else comfortable, you know exactly how heavy that kind of peace can be. From the outside, it looked like Vivian had everything: money, power, a house big enough to make people feel small when they walked in the door. She could rewrite memories with a single sentence, and everyone went along with it, because to question her version of events was to risk being pushed out into the cold. In a way, the story about the house was perfect for her. One tiny, convenient lie that did three things at once. It made her look generous, it made Patricia look helpless, and it reassured everyone else that nobody, not even the difficult daughter, could survive without her. That's how control works in families like that. It doesn't always come in the form of screaming or threats. Sometimes it comes disguised as a story, a favorite anecdote, a running joke. "Remember how I bought you that house?" Said enough times that it stops being a line and becomes a fact no one dares to question. But paper doesn't lie, and people can only ignore their own discomfort for so long. When Patricia laid those documents on the table, those bland, boring, utterly undeniable pieces of her life, she wasn't just proving who paid a mortgage. She was doing something much bigger. She was putting her version of reality next to her mother's and saying, "Here, compare them, decide for yourselves." That's a terrifying thing to do when you've spent a lifetime being told your memory doesn't count. Have you ever had someone in your family insist something happened a certain way and everyone just believed them, even when it scraped against your bones like it was wrong? Have you ever looked around a room full of people who share your blood and realized you're the only one who remembers the story differently? That's the kind of loneliness money can't fix. For Patricia, the house was never really about bricks and wood. It was about what those bricks and that wood stood for. Every payment was a small act of defiance, a quiet declaration, I can build something without you. Every year they held on to that house was proof that William and Patricia's version of success, modest, ordinary, grounded in service and love, was just as real as Vivian's skyscrapers and shopping malls. But as long as everyone believed Vivian had bought that house, none of that mattered. The sacrifices, the pride, the nights staring at the numbers, erased with one lie and a confident smile. That's why the folder mattered, not because Patricia needed to win an argument, but because she needed to anchor her reality in something no one could gaslight away. She needed her children, her grandchildren, and maybe most of all, herself, to see in black and white that she wasn't crazy, ungrateful, or remembering wrong. She had done exactly what she always believed she had done. She just hadn't been believed. There's a quiet kind of grief that comes when you realize people you love chose the easier story over the truer one. Elaine and Thomas had to sit there and face the fact that for years it had been simpler to nod along with Grandma's tale than to dig deeper into their mother's. That hurts, for them and for her. But there's also something strangely healing in that moment, when the truth finally sits in the middle of the table and no one can pretend not to see it anymore. Because from there, at least, you have a place to start, a real one, not built on pretending. Patricia didn't get a tearful apology from her mother. She didn't melt decades of control with one confrontation. Vivian was who she was, a woman so terrified of being powerless again that she'd rather rewrite her children's lives than admit she'd been wrong. In another kind of story, maybe there would have been a scene where she broke down, admitted everything, begged for forgiveness, but life rarely wraps up that neatly, especially with people who've spent a lifetime using power as armor. Instead, what Patricia got was something both smaller and bigger. She got to walk away knowing she had finally chosen herself over the version of herself her mother needed her to be. She wasn't the child begging for approval anymore. She wasn't the widow quietly enduring jokes about being saved by her rich family. She was a woman who had done the hard thing the hard way and finally claimed it out loud. And once you've heard yourself do that, really heard it, it's hard to go back to the old silence. The rest of the family, they were left with questions they couldn't easily bury. How many other stories sounded flattering, but felt off, if they were honest? How many times had they nodded along to something that didn't sit right in their gut because it was easier than pushing back? When you grow up in a system where the person with the most money also controls the narrative, you learn early that comfort often costs you your curiosity. Patricia's choice at that Christmas table didn't just free her, it cracked the surface for everyone else too. Not all of them would climb out. Some would seal the crack back up, tell themselves it wasn't that deep. Others would spend the rest of their lives quietly turning that night over in their minds, wondering what else they'd been wrong about. Not just about Patricia, but about themselves. Because if the failure hadn't really failed, what did that make the success stories? Standing in her own living room a year later, surrounded by kids and mismatched pajamas and a slightly crooked tree, Patricia could have looked back and seen only what she'd lost: access, status, the illusion of belonging at that long, glittering table. Instead, what she felt was something far more valuable and far more rare: ease, the kind that comes when you're no longer gripping the edge of someone else's approval just to stay in the room, the kind that lets you breathe without checking the emotional weather at the head of the table first. There's a saying that the truth will set you free. What people don't mention is that first, it might blow up your seat at certain tables. It might cost you invitations, inheritances, the right to be called good by people who only define goodness as obedience. But here's what Patricia's story shows. Sometimes losing your place in someone else's kingdom is the only way to finally come home to your own. The house she walked back into that night wasn't any bigger than it had been the day before. The paint was still chipped in places, the furniture was still worn, the mortgage had long been paid off. Nothing had changed on paper, and yet everything felt different. Because now every wall, every floorboard, every dent and scratch carried a new, unshakable meaning. This was mine, not because a billionaire said so, not because a lie made it easier for other people to feel superior, but because I lived it. I paid for it. I chose it. In a world, and in families, where people with more money, more power, or just louder voices will always be tempted to rewrite history in their favor, holding on to your own story is a quiet rebellion. It won't always change them. It might not make them apologize, but it will change you. It will anchor you in a truth that doesn't need anyone else's permission to exist. Patricia didn't walk out of that mansion with a check or a promise or a blessing. She walked out with something much harder to measure and impossible to buy. The certainty that whatever anyone else said, she knew what she had built. She knew what it had cost. And she knew finally that she would rather be alone in a small, honest house than surrounded in a palace built on lies where she had to vanish to keep the peace. And that, for the rest of her life, was worth more than anything her mother could have left her in a will.